Welcome. Welcome. I'm so glad that you're able to be here with us this afternoon. My name is Matt Croasmun. I am the Faith Initiative Director at Grace Farms, coming to you today from my home office in New Haven, Connecticut. So glad that you could join us for our conversation this afternoon. A couple of housekeeping notes as we get started. First, you'll have been alerted, I believe, by the software that this meeting is going to be recorded. We're excited to be able to share this conversation with a broader audience. In addition to all of those of you who are able to be here with us live. If you are here live, you're welcome to use the Q&A function throughout. I encourage you to, as soon as a question occurs to you, even if we won't have a sort of dedicated Q&A time in the event. So when a question occurs to you, go ahead and just drop it into the Q&A, and we'll respond to as many of your questions as we can, see if we can sort of weave them into our conversation that we have this afternoon. You know, this conversation today is part of a series, and this series is oriented around the Faith Initiative's question. Really, the treasure of the Faith Initiative is our question, and the question is this: what is the shape of flourishing life? And so as we engage with these different books on faith and meaning, we're wanting to ask, how can these texts help us make progress in our quest to answer this fundamental question about the shape of flourishing life? Now, our assumption is that reading is never enough, but at the same time, that texts can nevertheless give us access to people, to histories, to ideas that, if we allow them to do their work on us, can contribute substantially to our quest. One of the most important things that faith can offer us in this quest to discern the shape of flourishing life is what New Testament scholar Beverly Gaventa has called a widescreen view of life. Faith traditions offer views of the world that put it in its larger context. Often these views are what scholars of religion call two worlds accounts that describe the world we know, in some sense, normed by a transcendent realm. And revelation from this transcendent realm can provide critical leverage on the world in front of us that might be impossible if we had no access to any insight beyond it. So in light of faith's insight, the world suddenly becomes for us a gift from a creator God who is love, or an expression of the creative self-expression of Brahman, the infinite. Illusions can be dispelled. We are not as self-sufficient as we might imagine. We are not as limited as we might fear. Visions of life motivated by more than this world and its petty concerns suddenly become possible. Such is the renewal of the imagination that animates the lives of the faithful. But as we've noted in this past fall, in this very series, when we encountered Martin Hagelin's This Life, precisely the turn to the transcendent that gives faith leverage on the world can lead the faithful to disparage the world, to see it as just a land of sojourning or as fundamentally illusory in its nature. Such world-denying versions of the world's faiths are not, sadly, they're not uncommon. And they're a serious hindrance to the important work that faith traditions can do in making this world a place of flourishing for all people, and indeed for the natural world as well. Through deep original engagement with Advaita Hindu theology, today's book, A Hindu Theology of Liberation, and today's guest, Dr. Anantanand Rambachan, offer a model of how religious faith can in fact fuel transformative engagement with the world, precisely by virtue of theological insight. Dr. Rambachan is professor of religion, philosophy, and Asian studies at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. He is the author of many books, book chapters, and articles in scholarly journals. The BBC broadcasts a series of 25 lectures by Professor Rambachan around the world. He is a veteran of interfaith dialogue, especially Christian Hindu dialogue, including work that he's done over the years with my colleague Miroslav Volf at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Anant has personally been an inspiration to me in terms of what it looks like to pursue one's own religious faith and live by one's own religious convictions while engaging charitably with others who believe and live differently. Anant, if I may, I'm so grateful to have you with us today.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I am honored, and I am honored that you have this interest in my work, and you'd like me to talk more about it with your audience today. So I'm looking forward very much to our conversation. I'm very humble by your invitation to be here.
Well, thank you again for this book. In particular, I think what's so powerful about it is that you're doing two things and doing them in some compact space. You're both introducing readers to the Advaita tradition, and also at the same time then looking at giving us a window into how the sort of principles and insights of this tradition it might serve as a foundation for engaging on a number of sort of important contemporary issues. I wonder if we could start with that first piece, because I imagine we have many in our audience who will be well served by some of the introduction that you provide in this book. I wonder if we could begin here. You say that, like Buddhism, Advaita Vedānta sees the fundamental human problem as one of suffering. And yet it's a particular type of suffering, which you describe as, quote, a fundamental sense of insecurity of the self. I wonder if you would help us, I wonder if you'd say more about that and help us perhaps even identify in our own lives where this sort of insecurity of the self might appear or might be at work.
Yes, okay, thank you. So let me step back and respond to your question. Broadly, I say something about the Hindu tradition and then come down to Advaita. So the Hindu tradition, broadly speaking, the tradition looks to the 4 Vedas as sources of authoritative teaching. These are the most fundamental texts shared widely across the family of Hindu traditions. Now, the last part of each of these 4 collections, the 4 Vedas, where we find the wisdom teachings of the tradition, or we find Hindu theology. And this is, recorded and preserved in the form of conversations between great teachers and their students. Not completely unlike, some of the encounters you would have in the Gospels between Jesus and someone who asks him a question and he would respond. So these are the collections of conversations, between teachers and students, between gurus and their disciples. And so we have several traditions, theological traditions within the family of Hindu traditions that are based on readings and interpretations of these conversations. And these traditions are known, in Sanskrit as Vedanta traditions, because the word Vedanta means the end of the Vedas. So any tradition that is based on a reading and interpretation of these conversations, and these conversations are also called Upanishads, these are called Vedanta traditions. So Advaita, which is the tradition that is the focus of both my scholarship, but also my practice. I like to describe myself, Matthew, as a scholar practitioner of my tradition. So Advaita is a tradition that I study and which I practice. So in order to comment on your question about suffering, let me just say something more about Advaita. The word Advaita actually literally means not two. And that's a very important translation, not two. And it is an attempt to describe the relationship between the infinite divine and the world of nature and human beings. So, for example, a pantheistic description would focus a lot more on saying that they are one, that they can't be differentiated. Also, I would say that's monism, that completely identifies the infinite divine with our world, our universe. And secondly, you have another extreme, you have the very dualistic traditions that speak of them as entirely apart and different, separate spatially and otherwise. So Advaita finds a way to talk about the divine world relationship without going to the extremities of saying that they are one, but also by avoiding also saying that they are two. So it's not one, but also not two. So this is what the tradition is trying to articulate, what it means to describe the relationship between divine and human as not two. And so it proposes, or it reads the Upanishads to propose that there is something about our relationship with the divine at heart that we do not know. In other words, we are born into a universal ignorance. In Sanskrit, we speak of this as avidya. And the primary expression of this avidya is to think of everything in reality as separate and different and disconnected. And most important, we don't appreciate that we are connected fundamentally to this the infinite divine. So ignorance expresses itself in separateness and also fundamentally in the separateness of self from the divine. In fact, nothing can be separate from the divine. Nothing can be apart from the divine by space or by time. We intersect. We live, as you say, we live and move and have our beings in that one. One of the great Upanishads says, begins in the first verse by saying that we should see the world, the universe as wrapped in the divine, as enfolded in the divine. So when we think, you asked me about the sense of insecurity of self. When in this condition of ignorance, we do not understand, our relationship with the infinite divine, with sacred mystery, with what we call in our tradition as Brahman, the unlimited, and we experience ourselves, we experience separateness, we experience incompleteness, we experience a deep existential want and lack. There's a sense of lack that in our tradition can only be eliminated. Fullness of being can only come as a consequence of understanding our relationship with the infinite divine who is present, with us. But disconnection from that causes us to experience an anxiety, a lack of fullness, which we then attempt to fill unsuccessfully, Matthew, by pursuing power, by pursuing wealth, by pursuing fame and name, seeking to control others. But at heart, there is this lack. There is this sense of lack that none of these things can ever satiate. We sort of become runners in a race without a finishing line. So in our understanding, the only thing that can truly remove this ignorance, this fundamental ignorance, and lead to flourishing life is a true understanding and life that is grounded in this infinite divine.
Which, as you describe it in the book, then that means that we are when we're living in this state of ignorance, we are trying to attain by the wrong means what we already have. We're chasing after some sort of the infinite, when we actually already, if we understood ourselves rightly, we would see that we participate already in the infinite, or yeah.
That's a very good way to put it, Matthew. What we are seeking is what we already are. This gift, we have the gift of unity at the deepest levels of our being with the infinite divine, where there is fullness, there is adequacy, there is no lack, there is no want. In other words, in the Advaita tradition, we are what we are struggling most anxiously to become. We already are that. We are already given that. This is the problem of, this is why we describe it as the problem of ignorance. And so there are many analogies that are given in the Upanishads to explain this problem. Human nature is not understood as, as fundamentally and intrinsically broken or flawed. The problem, as you have, you started off to discuss, the problem is described as one of avidya, implying that, what we are seeking is sort of covered by this cloud of not knowing, which has to be dispelled by the spiritual discipline of knowledge.
And as you describe it, then, as someone very familiar with the Christian liberation tradition, I was surprised then. It seems that the category of liberation ends up getting used in a sort of surprising way to me. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but it seems then that liberation is first and foremost a matter of insight or knowledge. And then you say there are social consequences of liberation. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes. So because the problem, the human problem, if I would put it in this way, and here, of course, we are talking about the fundamental human problem. There are many human problems, but in our traditions, we also are seeking to identify what we would call, the most fundamental of these problems. And so that problem is the one that is described in the language of avidya. And then, of course, avidya has its own consequences. But because the problem is described in the terms of avidya, it is, we can say accurately, an epistemological problem. It's a problem of not knowing reality as it is, not knowing ourselves as we are. But the process of overcoming avidya is a discipline, Matthew. It is a discipline because it has entered so deeply into our beings. It has shaped so much our disposition, the quality of our relationships with other human beings, our relationships with the world of nature. We have to undo. We have to transform ourselves. Knowledge is transformative. It's a discipline. We have to transform our relationships, our relationships with other human beings, with the world of nature, through proper understanding of the most fundamental truths of ourselves.
I wonder, so that reminds me of a sort of a tension that exists in my tradition. I wonder, does this leave the practitioner in a bind as to whether the thing we most owe one another is knowledge or justice? And the reason I ask this question, as I said, I think there's an analogous sort of concern about, in the Christian tradition, about whether the most compassionate thing a Christian can do is evangelize, help someone come to understand their predicament as a human being, or whether the most compassionate thing they can do is to relieve the material causes of suffering in the life of another. And Christian liberation theologians resolve this conflict in part by just identifying the two. Liberation simply is God's work in history. Saving faith or material liberation, they only seem like two different things. How is that potential conflict sort of resolved as you see it?
So within the Hindu tradition, broadly speaking, and of course today we are speaking in a special way about the non-dual tradition, I think that this is a really interesting question that you have raised for me. And in this tradition, I would have to acknowledge that when liberation has been thought of, when liberation has been unpacked, liberation has been discussed, it's largely talked about as the overcoming of suffering that is identical with this most fundamental ignorance that I have identified. So liberation from suffering is liberation from this fundamental condition of suffering. That has been the emphasis. Now, part of my work in this book is to make connections between liberation, this most fundamental liberation, what you call, speaking of us justice in the world, the suffering that our fellow human beings experience because of structural inequalities that lead to lack of access to things like, of course, healthcare, education, economic resources to fulfill their human potential. So my argument, Matthew, is that we in the Hindu tradition and in the Advaita tradition, we have to enlarge our understanding of suffering. We should not narrowly construe suffering and limit it only to a very spiritualized understanding of suffering. Because I believe and I hold very firmly that the liberation, the understanding of liberation that is offered in the Advaita tradition provides a place of meaning which enables us to speak and to act on behalf of those who suffer, the lack of resources, the lack of dignity because of structural racism, casteism, gender injustice, and so on. I think that we must also address the fundamental problem, because if we don't, we end up repeating it all the time. Since it's the source in so many ways of the kind of oppression that we inflict upon each other. But we should really be moving to address both of these and not focus singly and solely on suffering construed as or identified with ignorance.
So one of the ways I saw you making a move, I think that's in line with just what you're saying right now, is you take the knots of the heart that result from misapprehension and are mostly, as I understand it, traditionally talked about in terms of at the individual level. You say that these consequences are also visible at the social level, as if there are, maybe this is my imagination running away with me, so rein me in if I've gone the wrong direction, but almost as if there are collective selves who are also subject to a fundamental sense of insecurity, and institutions looking in all the wrong places to secure themselves or secure ourselves and become infinite. Am I following you correctly there? And I wonder if you could describe some of the ways that the knots of the heart sort of apply also at the social level.
So you are reading my work very accurately, Matthew, because what I'm also trying to do in my work in Hindu liberation theology is to stretch or expand these teachings that were interpreted in highly individualistic ways. and less so in terms of their social applications. So coming back to what you spoke of, the knots of the heart. So the knots of the heart is a really, to me, it was a very beautiful and interesting expression that I found used a few times in the Upanishads in sort of unpacking this fundamental ignorance. So the knots of the heart are like 3 knots in a rope, so the primary knot, and then you had the secondary knots. So the primary knot of the heart is what we spoke of as avidya, or ignorance. But as we said at the very beginning of our conversation together, this ignorance expresses itself in this insecurity, self-insecurity, self-lack, self-want, lack of self-value, because it is based on this fundamentally flawed view of self as intrinsically incomplete and insufficient. And therefore, the second knot is the knot of greed. In order to satiate or to fill this emptiness, we begin to engage in certain kinds of actions. What will make me a full being? What will satiate this lack within myself? And this is where we speak about the grasp after power, the grasp to possess, the grasp to own, the grasp for fame that has no satiation point. And then, of course, so the first avidya, ignorance leads to greed, karma, and then greed expresses itself in greedful actions or karma. So what I am saying in this work as well is that this knot of the heart, surely we can think of it individually as we've been doing, for hundreds and hundreds of years within the tradition, but it also expresses itself in structures, in economic structures of greed. Greed is not only an individual phenomena, but it manifests itself outwardly in certain kinds of power structures, in racism, in casteism, in sexism. All of these are expressions, I think, of what you are asking me about, of the knots of the heart, and of course they have to be addressed differently, because they have social implications. So the social implications, my work is concerned in this sense with 2 things. One is, I want to speak also about, in this book, about the social implications of avidya, not only about its individual implications. And secondly, I want to speak about the social implications of liberation, and not only individually.
That's really helpful. You've mentioned now a couple. You work in the book a number of sort of examples of these social dynamics. So you've mentioned the caste system a couple of times now. I found that really, we had to say, really engaging there. One just to get a sentence on the table. You say it is the task, because it's a particular challenge that I identify as someone who's also a scholar practitioner of a religious tradition, this dynamic of having to recognize, we've gotten some things wrong. We've fallen short of some of our own best ideals. And I love this sentence. You say, it is the task of moving from defensive apologetic to self-criticism and articulating a vision of the tradition that affirms human dignity and worth. Trying to encourage, I think it's such an elegant summary of the task, as I think about it, that lies before, say, white American Christians. How do we move from defensive apologetic vis-a-vis American Christianity's complicity maybe is even too distant, right? But the fundamental American Christian sort of commitment for centuries to the racist white supremacist project of America. How do we move from defensive apologetic into a sort of productive self-criticism? I wonder if you could just say more about that sort of posture towards one's own tradition and beginning to sort of come to terms with these dynamics.
Well, thank you for that question, Matthew. I think that, writing a book on liberation theology, Hindu liberation theology, as I've tried to do in this work, meant that I had to confront also, as your question suggests, I had to confront the structures of oppression within my own tradition, and not simply the structures of oppression that, but the structures of oppression that have also sought and received religious legitimacy. And for me, the primary, one of the primary expressions of that is the caste system, the hierarchical ordering of human beings into categories of higher and lesser value. And this is where, what you identified as, and where I spoke about the necessity for scholars like us to be self-critical, to acknowledge that we, in my case, we are all afflicted by avidya, and the flaws of avidya, which cause us in some ways to be inhumane. We have to acknowledge our inhumanity, our injustice, our oppression, in this case of caste, that has been legitimized by the tradition. So we have to begin by owning responsibility for the physical and the psychological suffering imposed on the Dalits, those who are at the lowest levels of the caste structure, and who are represented as the untouchable other, in relation to whom Hindu identity is often affirmed. And of course, like your work and others in the Christian tradition, I have to retrieve, what is the redemptive vision in my own tradition to speak to an issue of social hierarchy and oppression like caste. And so that's where I dive deep, Matthew. And for me, coming back to the Advaita tradition, I'm inspired, I am motivated by the teaching that is there, and it can't be missed also, that, at the most fundamental level of our beings, the divine is equally present in everyone. This is the source of, the most fundamental source of human dignity, human value. And this is what motivates me to work to dismantle such exploitative and oppressive structures, and to do so from a place of theological meaning. So, my own work, Matthew, what I think distinct, there are many people who are working quite rightly to combat caste and to challenge caste. And they're doing it from places of meaning that are outside of religious commitment. It's harder, undoubtedly, because as you acknowledge, our traditions have been complicit in these structures. But I'm trying to do it from a place of commitment to my tradition, and working from those resources where I find the deepest meaning to contest such structures.
It's beautiful. I relate so much to that that challenge, and it does seem, it can be seen sometimes as naive, but I share your hope that in fact they can be the richest responses to in fact go back to these traditions and try to see what sorts of resources are there to do that, those works of recovery, to see what sorts of resources might be there to answer, sort of do better than the tradition itself has done in following its own insights.
So so we have to contend, Matt, and to do so respectfully, with those who at one end would say, and I mean, there are people both within who were Hindus and opted out of the Hindu tradition, and there are those who have always been outside, who would say that there was nothing redemptive in the Hindu tradition. You know, the whole thing just needs to be dismantled. That's one, I mean, that's one group, or those are groups that, you know, we have to speak to. And secondly, on the other side, of course, there are those who are not willing even today to acknowledge, you know, the connectedness between caste hierarchy and religious tradition, or even to acknowledge, you know, the caste system as a problem. So those of us who work with commitment to the tradition, you know, we try to find, I mean, we try to find a very sincere space. We have to wrestle with complexity, the complexity of our traditions, the complexity of our texts, Matthew, but because, you know, we have a profound sense for so many reasons, a profound sense of a transcendent mystery. The understanding of which and our experience of which leads us to these places of struggle, like, you know, contesting oppressive structures.
You refer many times in your book to Gandhi as, of course, one who has, within your tradition, struggled against oppressive structures, but you particularly highlight him as maybe the most powerful contemporary proponent or exponent of ahimsa, non-harm. What do you take to be Gandhi's most valuable insights to the nature of ahimsa, and to what extent should we understand Gandhi's thoughts about non-harm as fundamentally Hindu insights, and to what extent were his ideas sort of sourced from elsewhere? I guess like what I'm gearing towards, and we can have a couple back and forths on this, but it's thinking in the American context, we talk a lot about nonviolence, and it seems to me we owe an intellectual debt to your tradition for that. So I would just love some insight from you on how, but maybe we can start there. Gandhi's sort of explication or of ahimsa, and sort of especially the way you talk about him trying to draw our attention to the fact that there's a positive component of ahimsa, not just non-harm, but some positive demands as well.
Yes. So thank you for that question, Matthew. First of all, ahimsa is, in the Hindu tradition, you know, if you look across the sacred texts, it is I would say, is the cardinal ethical virtue. In fact, when we look at how these virtues are enumerated in the sacred writings, ahimsa always comes first. You know, even higher than truth. It is not hurting, not harming. And there are many, you know, narratives that would want to make the case of non-hurting sometimes as higher than truth itself. So Gandhi was clearly, you know, cognizant of that, and that's where, first of all, that he absorbed that value from the tradition. But I think that, and he himself acknowledged it, that his understanding of the challenges of practicing ahimsa were deeply inspired by his encounter with Christianity and with Jesus. The example of Jesus, as he said, you know, has been an important part of his understanding of what it means to take the risks of nonviolent love, as he would call it, or as he preferred to speak of it in Sanskrit as satyagraha, the love force, or the force of truth. So he read deeply, you know, when he was a student in England and then in South Africa, Tolstoy, the writings of Tolstoy, who also was an advocate of, you know, nonviolence and a life of simplicity. But there hasn't been a Hindu in recent times who has written perhaps as much about um, Jesus as Gandhi and the influence of Jesus on him. So I want to say that in Gandhi's, creative articulation and practice of nonviolence, there have been many influences, and the influence of Jesus is one such powerful example. He was really interesting because he enthusiastically embraced Jesus' love ethic without necessarily thinking that he had to become Christian to do that. He was not at all interested in institutionalized Christianity, but he was interested in the spirituality of Jesus. Now, what I have tried to do in this book, and then of course, as you mentioned, let me just also say that you had other, African Americans and during the civil rights era going to learn from Gandhi, making that trip to India. Martin Luther King Jr. himself went to India, but Gandhi had already passed away. But actually there were others who went before him to learn this method. So it's one of the interesting interreligious realities where you had Gandhi, the Hindu, looking to Jesus in such important ways for the ethic of nonviolent resistance, and then you had Christians coming to learn from the Mahatma. It was very fascinating. Now, ahimsa, by and large, I would say, has largely been understood like so many other important Hindu ethical teachings in an individual manner. And Gandhi's contribution is one that was really described well by Martin Luther King Jr. He says Gandhi was the first person in history, I'm summarizing, to transform the love ethic of Jesus into a mode of social resistance, into a mode of social resistance. And I'm inspired by that. And in my own work, I'm trying to tease out as well, continue to tease out like Gandhi, the social implications of ahimsa, because as you referenced in your question, he also spoke about this relationship between ahimsa, non-injury, and justice. He says you cannot be non-violent if you don't also stand up and resist injustice. I find that to be a source of deep inspiration, that ahimsa was really not turning away from injustice, but turning towards then challenging and confronting injustice. Because the word itself is a negative, not hurting. And but Gandhi also emphasized, as you said, that this is not really negative, it's very positive. It's a positive way of engaging the world for transformation.
While we're thinking, it's a beautiful picture. I love that picture of that sort of cultural exchange. And sometimes it does feel this way. Reading Christian reflection on nonviolence, it seems like Gandhi rescued Jesus for the American church, and the American church really learned a lot about Jesus from the way that Gandhi interpreted him in light of Gandhi's own religious tradition.
Question that came up. Do you mind if we take a look at it?
This I was say, yeah. So I thought I was going to use that to turn to this question. The participant asks, there's a massive ongoing effort by Christian missionaries, especially evangelists from the United States, to leverage caste injustices in converting Hindus to Christianity. What is your position on such efforts?
My position is as follows. I think as Hindus, we have to take very seriously an important fact, which is that, and this is true even today, that the highest number of converts from the Hindu tradition, the so-called Hindu tradition, the larger Hindu tradition, to other religions, including, here the question is asking me about conversion from the Hindu traditions to Christianity, but there's also Islam, that the largest numbers of converts have come from the so-called untouchables, those who are at the very bottom of the caste structure. And so I think in line with our earlier conversation about self-critical examination of tradition, we ought to be asking ourselves why. Why? What is it about the Hindu tradition? What is it about human dignity, human value for self that that might also explain the attraction of Hindus to another religious tradition? So I think that's an important question. And there is no doubt, yes, of course, you know, that the caste structure, I'm not sure if it has to be leveraged, you know, to draw people from the Hindu tradition to another tradition. But if a tradition offers human beings, at least theoretically, a theological value for self and human dignity, I think we have to understand why people would be attracted to that. Having said that, let me also say that the problem of caste in India, while it is a special problem, you know, for the Hindu tradition, what we have seen and what we are still seeing is that caste structures also transcend the Hindu tradition. There are caste structures in Islam. There are caste structures still in the Christian tradition, even with conversion. You know, I mean, there are so many glaring examples of Dalits having to sit at the back of the churches, Dalit bodies not allowed in Christian cemeteries. So that this structure, these hierarchical structures, while of course they have sought explanation within the Hindu tradition, they also transcend traditions. And my own position is that I think we should be addressing this kind of structures together. I think Hindus and Christians together should be addressing these kinds of hierarchical structures. I respect deeply the right of people to change their religious traditions. I think that's a fundamental human right that everyone ought to have, and it is necessary. But I would hope that, you know, Christians and people of other religious traditions also have to look, you know, at their own communities and the structures of hierarchy that exist there, even the caste-like structures that are still part of Hindu, but also part of Buddhist, part of Christian, part of Islamic, part of Sikh, you know, communities in India. No community has freed itself, you know, from these kinds of hierarchies, and to see it as a common challenge, as a common problem, and to find ways to speak together about human dignity, about human value, to find a common theological resources that we can bring to address these issues. That's my position, Matthew.
If I could take a moment from my position to answer this question as well, I really appreciate your response. The first move of humility makes me think about, especially given that the question notes that these evangelists are often coming from the United States, that the account that you've just given of or the question you've posed to your own tradition, why are untouchables converting at higher rates, I think is a question that obviously the American church has had to ask itself for many years now, going back at least as far as the rise of the Nation of Islam, and questions about why Black Americans have been leaving the American church. And so I think there are analogous questions there to be asked. And to me, that points to a sort of principle of interreligious dialogue that especially this word in the question, to leverage caste injustices. Do we want to be leveraging our our neighbors' sort of shortfall in their own tradition? Do we want to be leveraging those things, or do we want to be trying to interact charitably? In my own view, as someone who, within the Christian tradition, I agree with you. Conversion is part of just human freedom. But to me, the sort of best picture of evangelism, I think, is a sort of charitable dialogue, mutually enlightening dialogue between sturdy adherents. I mean, I especially like a conversation among sturdy adherents to given traditions. But I think we'd want to have a charitable posture towards those traditions and want to engage in those conversations with again, leveraging seems like you might try to find the weakest link and pick at that, rather than try to seek out your most considered dialogue partner, right? Not to score a win, but to enter into the deep sort of mutual learning that might go in both directions. So anyway, those.
No, I appreciate that, and that's exactly what you've said better than what I was trying to say, that we should come together in dialogue to talk about these issues, and without blindness to the injustices within our own tradition, as our great teacher said, let us not see the speck of dust in the other's eyes and miss the plank in our own eyes. But I am always troubled, I must add, when the convert is treated as a child who doesn't know what is good for him or her. And that very, very much disturbs me, that the convert is treated as an immature child. And when people may know why they are, what are the sources of their suffering, and they're looking for ways in which self-worth can be affirmed, I think we should not think of them in this way.
Well, we're getting towards the end of our time. I don't know if we can get to two last questions I have. I have more questions, but we'll get to maybe two of them. One is, theologically, what you're doing in this book seems to me is really centered around this. You're trying to, I think, as I understand it, try to restore it's in the title, restore the proper meaning of the non-dualistic insight of your tradition, which means giving this sort of account of God and the world. And that I was just really captivated when you got to the point even of allowing yourself to dare to ask a question about God's purposes, or Brahman's purpose in creating the world. It's a beautiful picture. I wonder if you would just describe what is, because this might help us understand the world that we live in, right? That's the claim. What were Brahman's purposes in creating the world?
Matthew, it's a fundamental question that continues to engage me right onto the present day. I wrote a piece most recently in the Handbook of Hindu-Christian Relations, where I was reflecting on this question. It's not an easy question. As a theologian, you would appreciate it very much. But I raised that question in my work, and I continue to struggle with it, because I have found that within the Hindu tradition, by and large, the question is not at all raised. The question is, in fact, because of certain ways of understanding the significance of the world, and especially when the world is dismissed and not attributed, any value or even any reality, then asking, what is the purpose of creation doesn't become very prominent. So I raised that question. It's not a question that is asked a lot in the tradition in which I speak, but the direction I am going in, Matt, and there are texts that I draw from in trying to answer this question and to continue to unpack this question. And those are the significant texts in the Upanishads, that we spoke about before, where you have this, and of course, all descriptions of divine nature, only analogical, metaphorical, but this describes a deep wish on the part of the one unlimited sacred mystery for self-multiplication. May I become many. May I multiply myself. And I see those texts as providing a very rich pathway to speaking of creation as divine sharing of self, divine giving. Because self-multiplication is an act of giving. I speak of it as the overflow of divine abundance, that we are being invited to share in the fullness of divine reality, in the fullness of divine life. And so the world as expression of divine fullness, for me, is profoundly enriching of the world. That the divine, without any loss of being, without any diminishing or diminution of the fullness of being, brings forth out of itself this wonderful world that we are blessed to be part of. That's the direction I am going in my thinking, but it's a continuing question that I work to articulate. I don't think that we can separate the question of human meaning, Matthew, from also the question of divine purpose in creation.
You've come to this word that you use to great effect in the book. You talk about the human quest for fullness.
Yes.
And I believe I've heard Miroslav pick up that language. This quest in many ways is a human universal. And yet the ways we think about it, even or especially the ways we imagine that fullness itself, seem to be so particular to each religious or cultural tradition. I just wonder, one of the things that we're trying to pursue here in the Grace Farms Faith Initiative is precisely this sort of interfaith sort of pursuit of the shape of flourishing life. So I just wonder, how do you think about that dialectic? Are we all looking for the same thing, or are we in fact looking for something different because we understand that fullness that we're aiming at differently? And what might that teach us about how we can learn from one another across traditions?
I think that if we for a moment, not try to separate, at least if we can, our religious traditions from us as human beings, I think that the most fundamental needs of human beings are identical. And I think that the quest for fullness is a universal. I name it fullness, people might call it by other names, but I think the quest for fullness is a universal human quest, perhaps addressed differently in our traditions, but very basic to us as human beings. Because I think, I was reading recently, James Cone's writings, African-American liberation theologian, and he spoke from a different place, from a different journey, but he spoke about the impossibility of life without self-value. It is impossible. And he said that African-Americans keep going back to the Christian church and holding on to the Christian identity, because that's one place where, of course, within the Black churches, they found value. They found a theology that affirmed their self-value, their self-worth. This is the one place where their self-worth was not diminished. They could own a fullness of being. I just give that example because I think he was right. What I'm calling fullness, I think others like James Cone spoke of as this quest for self-value, for owning oneself. How could one live if one does not have a healthy sense of one's worth or a sense of fullness of being. Of course, in my tradition, that fullness is a divine gift that is already with us. That is in fact, we will say it's our deepest nature. It is the most fundamental truth of who we are. We speak of this truth as the truth of the Atma, the most fundamental self, which is not the ego, but which is the most fundamental level of being. And I think that religious traditions endure, Matthew, because in one way or the other, they provide an answer to this human need, this fundamental human quest. It's not the same answer, but surely it's an answer to that, that human need.
Yeah, not a shared answer, a shared question.
Shared question, yes. Yes.
Yeah, that we share together. Well, Anant, I thank you. I know that I've come to know you as one with whom I share this question, and I'm so grateful for you taking some time today to share your reflections with our community. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for the privilege of this conversation, and I greet everyone who participated and listened to us. And as you said, I hope there would be another occasion when we could continue. But thank you for inviting me. Stay well and stay safe.